A few years ago, I presided at a wedding. There was a 3-year-old ring bearer. Since 3-year-olds are often unpredictable, the bridal party had adopted a scheme that they had seen at some other weddings, whereby the best man, who was the ring bearer's uncle, had a pack of gummy bears. And they just said to the 3-year-old, walk up and get the gummy bears from Uncle Jeff. And at rehearsal, that worked swimmingly. Kid came up, got the gummy bears. The next day at the wedding, the child is wearing strange clothes in this strange place among all these strange people. Took a little more cajoling and coaxing, and yet he came up to the front. He found his way up. But no one had thought to bring a second pack of gummy bears. They had one pack and burned it off at rehearsal. So there's this moment of shock and terror on this young boy's face. And he's frozen and not happy. And the maid of honor tugs on my vestment and says, Deacon Steve, where are the gummy bears? And I don't know. I'm not in charge of gummy bears. There was no gummy bear class in deacon school. And with the entire bridal party in the church, the groom standing here waiting the arrival of his bride, this 3-year-old child had a complete meltdown. Broke down, and there was wailing and gnashing of teeth. And who could blame him? He was 3. About that same time, I was presiding at another wedding for a relative of mine, and same situation. They had a ring bearer who was about 3 years old, a young man who was the nephew of the bride. And there was no incentive, there was no reward for walking up the path. His mother was in the wedding party, and they said to him, walk on up by your mom. And at rehearsal, it went great. He walked right up to his mom, perfect. The next day at the wedding, dressed in these strange clothes in this strange place among all these strange people, the meltdown started in the back. And he started to cry, and he was not going to walk up the aisle. And without missing a beat, the groom just steps forward, walks the length of the church, gets to the back, gets down on one knee, and gives the little boy a hug. And he wiped his tears, and he gave him another hug. And then he scooped that little boy up in his arms, and he held him, and he carried him into the church. And that, my friends, is the kingdom of God. That's the kingdom of God. It wasn't what they practiced. It wasn't the protocol. This wasn't the rules and how it was supposed to happen. But the needs and the love for the least among us took priority over everything else. That action. Oh, and the cameras flashed, and the hearts melted, and all of the women in the church were so jealous that she was getting this guy. But that's the kingdom of God, picking up the least among us and carrying them in our arms. And this is what Jesus keeps trying to explain to people. The kingdom of God is not a noun, it's a verb. The kingdom of God is not a reward like gummy bears. It's an action. The kingdom of God is not a place. It's a disposition of heart. It's a way of life. It's that willingness to love and be sensitive to the brokenness of others. The kingdom of God is, yes, that tiny little mustard seed which planted in our heart becomes this life-giving tree. That pinch of yeast which when kneaded into our lives raises the dough that feeds the multitudes. And that's what Jesus keeps trying to tell people. It's not a place, it's not a reward. It's a disposition of heart. It's the way you love. It's the love you put in the world that just lives forever and never dies. And you can do it now. And he keeps telling us that too. And sometimes we have a hard time getting our heads around it, because we too were introduced to the idea of heaven about the same time we were introduced to the idea of Santa Claus. And we were taught this as though it's some sort of behavior modification which works for a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old, and follow these rules and walk this path and you will get the gummy bears. And Jesus is saying, you're grown-ups. It doesn't work like that. Don't walk the path to get the candy. Walk the path with a heart of love, because you want to be with all that is good, with all humanity, and with the goodness of God, to be part of that. And if you walk that path, he says to us, if you walk this path hoping for some big reward, the Lord's going to look at you and say, I don't know where you're coming from. I don't know where you're coming from. Are you coming from some sense of entitlement? Are you coming from some sense of earned, deserved reward? Are you coming out of self-interest? Is that why you come? Because the heart that's filled with love, loving neighbor as self, loving God with heart, mind, and soul, loving enemy. The heart that's filled with love comes just out of love. And he says, we'll say, but Lord, I came and we ate and drank with you. He'll say, I don't know where you're coming from. Because that doesn't look like the love that feeds the multitudes, that gives life. That doesn't look like the love that scoops in their arms and carries the least among us. That's what I recognize. I recognize that love. And that's a tough message to hear in these very tough times. Because we have to examine ourselves. We have to examine our heart and our culture. How are we living? Are we living with self-interest, hoping to get the gummy bears? Or are we living with the heart that loves the least among us and is open? That's the narrow gate. And are we living with that heart? No, the kingdom of heaven isn't a reward. It's rewarding, because true love gives everything and expects nothing. And that life lasts forever and is so very rewarding.